The news hit the market like a slap. China has halted imports of a range of U.S. agricultural products, citing inspection and quality concerns. On the surface, it sounds technical. Paperwork, food safety standards, border procedures, but in economic warfare, inspection isn't always just inspection. Sometimes it's a switch, a clean, legally defensible way to slow or choke off cash flow to an entire industry without ever announcing retaliation. And to be clear, in the real world, trade rarely goes from on to off overnight. This kind of move can be selective, by shipment, by port, by supplier, by timing. But with agriculture, China doesn't need a total cutoff to cause damage. All it needs is uncertainty. Because farmers don't live on headlines. Farmers live on cash flow, on specific dates. And that's where the story begins. Why agriculture is the perfect pressure point. If a major power wants leverage over the United States, agriculture is the textbook target for 3 reasons. First, it's geographically concentrated. The pain doesn't spread evenly across America. It lands hard in farm states, where soybean prices, corn prices, cattle prices aren't abstract numbers on a screen. They're mortgage payments, tuition, machinery maintenance, seasonal labor, the entire financial rhythm of small towns. Second, agriculture is seasonal, and time is not flexible. You can delay buying a car. You can postpone upgrading a phone. You cannot pause harvest. Storage is limited. Quality degrades. And the bank's calendar doesn't care about geopolitics. When the crop comes in, the system has to move. Third, inspection creates a gray zone. Tariffs are public and obvious. Inspections are technical, and technical claims are harder for the public to challenge in real time. That gives policymakers maximum pressure with maximum deniability. The first punch doesn't hit GDP. It hits the farmer's local cash price. Most people see the futures chart and think it's down a few percent. But farmers don't sell at the number they see on TV. They sell at the local cash price. Cash price isn't just the futures price. It's futures plus or minus the basis. The local spread driven by real-world demand, storage space, rail capacity, barge traffic, and port flow. If China slows purchases or creates uncertainty at the border, product backs up inside the U.S. That's when basis weakens, and that's when the real pain shows up. A futures dip of 5% can become something worse at the elevator, because the buyer knows the farmer is under pressure and needs to move the crop. That's the brutal part most people never see. Farmers don't just lose price, they lose cash flow, and cash flow is what kills. Modern farming is a leveraged business. Early season, seed, fertilizer, chemicals, diesel, machinery, labor. Much of it is financed. Short-term credit built around the harvest. End of season, you sell the crop to repay the operating loan and fund the next cycle. So if imports are paused or delayed at the wrong moment, the damage isn't just reduced profit. It's a cash flow shock. And cash flow shocks create a chain reaction. Revenue falls because pricing worsens. Costs rise because storage extends, interest accrues, logistics fees stack up. Credit tightens because banks see higher risk and pull back. And when credit tightens, the farmer loses choices. They may be forced to sell at a bad price, not because they want to, but because the calendar demands it. This is what pressure looks like in the real economy. Inspection sounds polite, the impact is not. There's a reason governments like using the inspection channel. It can be deployed in ways that look procedural while producing strategic effects. More testing, longer clearance times, temporary holds on certain suppliers, selective enforcement by port, by shipment, by timing. It doesn't need to be a headline ban. It just needs to become unpredictable. And unpredictability is enough to reprice the market, tighten credit, and push risk downward onto the least powerful actor in the chain. The shock spreads beyond the farm. Rural America slows down. Farmers are the first hit, but they're not the only hit. Around them is an entire local economy. Seed and fertilizer dealers, equipment sellers and repair shops, trucking and rail, local banks, food processing and storage operators. When farm income tightens, these businesses tighten. Hiring slows, orders drop, households delay spending, Small towns feel it immediately. This is how a trade issue becomes a regional economic slowdown. And yes, Washington can respond, but there are limits. The U.S. government can, and often does, support agriculture during trade shocks. But support has three problems. It rarely replaces the full income loss if a major buyer is disrupted for long. It becomes political. Who gets help, how much, and for how long? And it doesn't replace the market itself. You can write checks. You cannot instantly create a buyer on China's scale. Logistics, contracts, demand patterns, those don't reroute overnight. So why does this connect to Venezuela? Because this is how modern power competition works. Instead of direct confrontation, you pressure the opponent through internal fault lines, areas where economic pain converts into political pressure. If Washington escalates pressure around Caracas, Beijing doesn't need a military showdown to raise the cost for the U.S. It can hit a sensitive domestic node, one that produces immediate, visible pain. Agriculture is that node. Here's what most people miss. Beijing doesn't have to choose between buy everything and buy nothing. It can run a two-track strategy, keep enough trade flowing to protect its own food security and price stability while still creating maximum political pain inside the United States. That's what makes this so effective. Even if soybeans are still moving, China can still pressure U.S. agriculture, not with blunt bans, but with precision levers that create uncertainty, widen price discounts, and tighten rural credit at exactly the wrong moment. So how do you pressure farm country without a dramatic cutoff? By climbing an escalation ladder. 1. The escalation ladder, from noise to choke points. Think of this as a ladder with 4 rungs. Rung 1. Administrative friction. Low visibility, high impact. No headline ban. Just more inspections, additional documentation, port-by-port enforcement. The market hears one message: delays are possible. That alone can weaken local bases and tighten rural financing because everyone knows timing matters in agriculture. Rung 2. Targeted product pressure. Hit what's easiest to substitute. Beijing doesn't have to touch the one commodity it needs most right now. It can pressure categories that are easier to swap: meat, dairy, certain grains, ethanol byproducts, poultry, while still creating loud political pain in U.S. farm country. This is the precision version of retaliation. Pick the products that maximize pressure and minimize self-harm. Rung 3. State buyer step back. Change who buys and when. Even if China continues buying overall, it can change how the buying happens. State entities can step back, leaving private buyers exposed to uncertainty. Or the state can shift buying windows. Buy later, buy less aggressively, enough to hit prices at the worst time for U.S. producers. This is how you turn a stable market into a nervous market without ever saying, "We're done." Rung 4. Narrative warfare. Make inspections a political story. Quality and inspection becomes a national narrative. Food safety, compliance, security. That framing justifies policy domestically and boxes leaders politically, because now relaxing enforcement looks like being weak or risking safety. The point is simple. China's most powerful move isn't cutting everything off. It's making the U.S. farm economy feel like it's operating under a permanent threat of interruption. 2. Why this hits harder now. Farm economics are already tight. When margins are wide, trade pressure hurts, but it's survivable. When margins are thin, trade pressure becomes existential. Here's how farm finance works in real life. Farmers borrow early in the season because inputs aren't optional. They repay after harvest because cash flow has a calendar. When prices drop or basis weakens, the first thing that breaks isn't confidence, it's loan coverage, then credit terms, then forced selling. That's why soft pressure, delays, uncertainty, selective enforcement can snowball into hard outcomes fast. And that's why it becomes political. The pain is concentrated, visible, and tied to communities that vote, organize, and pressure Washington. 3. Washington's response options and why each one is costly. If China tightens pressure, the U.S. has several playbooks. None are clean. Option A. Subsidize and stabilize, domestic cushioning. This buys time, keeps farms solvent, and prevents a rural credit shock. But it turns trade pressure into a budget fight, and it doesn't replace demand. It's a bandage, not a market. Option B. Reroute exports. Find other buyers. In theory, the U.S. can push more volume to other markets. In practice, you can't instantly replace the scale, reliability, and pricing power of Chinese demand, especially for soy. New buyers take time. Logistics take time. Contracts take time. Option C. Retaliate. Tariffs, tech controls, finance pressure. This raises costs for China, but it invites counter-retaliation, and it risks expanding the fight from trade into systemic decoupling, where everyone pays more and uncertainty becomes chronic. Option D. Escalate the geopolitical theater, Venezuela. This is the dangerous one. If Washington treats the Venezuela operation as proof of strength, there's a temptation to double down, finish the job, reshape the outcome, control the transition. That's where mission creep begins. 4. Venezuela changes the strategic temperature. The Venezuela operation is not just a regional story, it's a signal event. It raises the stakes and pulls bigger actors into a contest over legitimacy, influence, and energy. Here's the strategic reality that matters. China doesn't need to fight America in Venezuela to make Venezuela expensive. It only needs to help create conditions where the U.S. can't exit cleanly. And that can happen through 3 channels. Channel 1, diplomatic isolation and legal warfare. International condemnation, UN pressure, regional pushback, and a push to brand the operation as illegitimate. Even limited diplomatic success forces Washington to spend political capital just to keep partners aligned and keep basing/cooperation intact. Channel 2, economic leverage through energy and debt exposure. China has major financial exposure tied to Venezuela's energy system and long-running oil-linked arrangements. That means Beijing has incentives to shape any transition, protect contracts, and influence who ends up controlling the country's revenue streams. If Venezuela fractures internally, every contract becomes contested, and every contested contract becomes a geopolitical bargaining chip. Channel 3, gray support, the realistic risk. This is where people go too cinematic. The more plausible risk isn't Chinese troops on the ground. It's dual use and deniable support that increases U.S. costs. Surveillance tools, communications gear, cyber support, intelligence sharing, drones, and quiet logistics that make stabilization harder and more expensive. Smart framing. China doesn't have to save Venezuela militarily. It just has to make sure the U.S. can't turn a raid into a clean victory. 5. Why quagmires happen. Raids are short, stabilization is long. Capturing a leader is a tactical event. Controlling what happens after is a strategic campaign. Once the leader is removed or detained, the questions multiply. Who controls the security services? Who controls the oil infrastructure? Who is seen as legitimate inside the country? How do you prevent sabotage, insurgency, or factional conflict? How do you manage backlash across Latin America? That's the trap. You can win the opening scene and still lose the story, because the cost isn't the strike. The cost is the months after. And this is where it connects back to U.S. agriculture. If Beijing can raise pressure in America's farm belt, while Washington is managing a volatile Venezuela aftermath, it creates a compound problem. Economic pain at home plus strategic risk abroad yields political pressure to escalate or retreat, and either choice comes with a price. Here's the uncomfortable reality. Capturing a leader is a tactical event. Stabilizing what comes after is a strategic war. That's where great powers get trapped, because once you remove the top figure, you inherit a vacuum filled with armed actors, contested legitimacy, broken institutions, and an energy system that becomes the prize everyone fights over. This is how mission creep starts. 1. Mission creep begins the moment a vacuum appears. The day after a high-profile capture, 3 questions explode at the same time. Who controls the security forces? Who controls the oil infrastructure and cash flow? Who is legitimate inside the country and across the region? If there isn't a single credible authority that can answer all 3, the country doesn't stabilize. It fragments, and fragmentation creates a brutal choice for Washington. Leave quickly, risk chaos, revenge killing, sabotage, and a rapid power reversal. Stay to stabilize, inherit responsibilities that were never part of the original mission. This is how a strike becomes a commitment. 2. The hardest battlefield isn't military, it's legitimacy. Even if you can secure key sites, legitimacy is a different war. A transition government that is seen as a foreign-installed project struggles to command loyalty. Security services split, local elites hedge, rival factions compete for recognition. The information environment turns poisonous. Every incident becomes propaganda, every mistake becomes fuel. And here's the trap. When legitimacy is weak, you need more force to compensate. More force creates more backlash. More backlash weakens legitimacy further. That feedback loop is how occupations become decades. 3. Outside powers don't need to defeat the U.S., they just need to block a clean exit. This is the key point for your video. China doesn't have to fight U.S. troops head-on to make Venezuela expensive. It only needs to help create conditions where the U.S. cannot exit cleanly. That can happen through 4 realistic methods. None of them require Chinese soldiers on the ground. A. Diplomatic containment, make the operation toxic. If the story becomes illegal intervention, neighbors get nervous. Cooperation becomes politically dangerous. Regional governments hedge. International bodies become arenas of pressure. The operational effect is simple. Fewer partners, fewer bases, fewer clean options. B. Economic leverage. Oil becomes the battlefield. Oil isn't just barrels. It's infrastructure, technicians, spare parts, terminals, pipelines, shipping insurance, and security. In a fragile transition, oil facilities become targets. Sabotage, theft, labor disruption, factional control. The moment oil output becomes uncertain, global prices react. That pushes risk premiums higher and can feed into U.S. domestic inflation pressures, exactly the kind of political headache Washington doesn't want while trying to manage a foreign crisis. C. Gray support. Deniable tools that raise costs. This is the realistic risk, not Hollywood. Support that complicates stabilization while staying deniable can include surveillance and communications gear, cyber support and information operations, drones and counter-drone systems, training and advisory networks routed through indirect channels, logistics that help a faction resist, hide, or coordinate. The goal isn't to win a conventional war. The goal is to make every month cost more: money, attention, credibility. D. Proxy entanglement. Local actors become the long war. Once factions believe outside powers are backing them, they fight longer. They compromise less. They wait out the U.S. political cycle, hoping Washington loses patience first. This is how a short operation becomes a slow bleed. 4. The U.S. gets pulled into an impossible checklist. If Washington stays, it inherits a checklist that never ends. Protect oil infrastructure, prevent revenge killings and factional violence, secure borders against arms flows, build a credible political transition, manage humanitarian needs, contain spillover into neighboring states, keep allies aligned, prevent the old regime from reconstituting underground. Each item is hard. Together they're a trap, because failing any single one can collapse the entire project. And every time something goes wrong, Washington faces the same instinct: send more resources to fix it. That's mission creep in its purest form. 5. The feedback loop back into the U.S. economy. Farm pressure plus oil risk equals political squeeze. Now connect this back to parts 1 and 2. If Beijing is applying pressure on U.S. agriculture through uncertainty, selective enforcement, and targeted trade friction, while Venezuela stays unstable and oil risk rises, the U.S. faces a compound problem: economic pain in farm country, higher energy uncertainty, inflation sensitivity at home, political division over foreign policy. That combination squeezes decision makers, And the worst part is both exits look bad. Escalate, costs rise, backlash grows, the mission expands. Exit. The vacuum narrative begins, and opponents frame it as failure. So the system drifts into the default, stay longer than planned. 6. The cold ending. The raid is the opening scene. The long war is the sequel. The real question isn't, can the U.S. strike? The real question is, can the U.S. manage the post-strike phase, legitimacy, security, oil, regional backlash, without getting dragged into a long stabilization campaign? Because this is how great powers get bled today. Not by losing one battle, but by being pulled into an open-ended chain of obligations they never intended to own.